And we're live. Good afternoon, everyone, and Assalamu alaikum. My name is Shahid Rahman. I'm the Executive Director of American Muslim Institution, AMI. As many of you know, we're an organization dedicated to building a better image of Muslims in this country. And part of that process involves engaging in dialogue with influencers and experts and the media. Here at AMI, we're interested in building scalable models to reach as many of our neighbors as possible to not only introduce Muslims, but also Islam. Today, we are excited to have author Asma Uddin join us. She is the author of the recent book, The Politics of Vulnerability. It was approximately 1 year ago at the beginning of the pandemic when we hosted Asma for our first virtual event for the book that she wrote, When Islam is Not a Religion, which explored different strategies that were being utilized to undermine Islam as a religion and to place it in a category of political expression. She made quite the persuasive case that by downplaying Islam as a religion, it would have long-term repercussions to the First Amendment. Although this book is not a direct sequel by any means, I do see certain through lines. There are certain feelings and vulnerabilities that lead people to feel that Islam is a threat and Christianity might be under threat. She expertly looks at the intersection of the role of religious and political identity plays in its ever expansive role in our society. I was really fascinated by the example she offered in the book of individuals who shop at Whole Foods might be associated automatically as liberals. It was a fascinating observation. I really like this book because of its, not only is it both expansive, but it's both digestible and persuasive, and attempts to reconcile an ever-growing political divide and cultural divide in America. I believe that this model that she's proposing can go beyond just healing Muslim-Christian relations, but also can initiate a broader healing that our society desperately needs and craves. As we speak about healing, Asma makes reference to the work of Imam Muhammad Majid and Pastor Bob Roberts to discuss their work about building empathy and dialogue between evangelicals and the Muslim community. Today, Imam Majid has offered us a few remarks. For those of you that are not familiar with Imam Majid, he is the executive Imam of the All Dulles Muslim Society Adams Center in Sterling, Virginia. He is a chairman of the International Interfaith Peace Corps and the former president of Islamic Society of North America, ISNA. He's also the chairman of Muflihun, a think tank which focuses on confronting violent extremist thought through research-driven preventive programs with a religious paradigm, Thanks, Imam Majid, for those. So right now, let me just play Imam Majid's remarks. One moment, please.
In the name of God, the source of mercy and the giver of mercy, I would like to share with you today the book of Asma Uddin, The Politics of Vulnerability. This book is a very important book in explaining the issue of religious freedom and how can we as a community, as people of faith, work together in addressing this issue of vulnerability in all communities. And you see in this book that of my work with the Pastor Bob Roberts been featured here, where we as Muslims, imams, and the evangelical pastors work together across America to try to understand the issue of the misunderstanding, why occurred between those two communities, what are the fear, what are the assumptions that we make about each other. And we do have retreats across America. In those retreats, really we address these issues that we mentioned in this book that the idea of understanding where the person come from and put yourself in other person's shoes, which is the philosophy of empathy. If you understand where the person come from, perhaps you can address their fear and their misconception, misunderstanding. And that's why I think that we need to have a dialogue, real dialogue, with depth, where we become vulnerable in that dialogue, so that we can have these possibilities. As people say that all relationship begins with exposure. Expose yourself for understanding the other people, come to know them. And that exposure will lead to vulnerability. And it will become vulnerable, then it become familiar. It lead to familiarity. And that familiarity lead to possibilities. And therefore, I really appreciate this really great work of Asma Uddin in this book. And I recommend it for everyone who work in the area of interfaith, religious freedom, to get this book. My hope is the book will become like a manual to train religious leaders in the issue of building better understanding and building bridges between communities, especially communities that they have a lot of mistrust between them. May God Almighty bless this kind of work and have all of us to create a community and a world where people really spend time to try their best to understand the others. Because you see, the word brother in Islam also has a word, the others with it. You know, the akhar, which is mean the others, include the word brother, which is akh, like the same thing in English. The word brother include the word other. For the person that whom we think that he might not have anything in common with us, if we get to talk to them, get to know them, we'll find a lot of commonality. But let us work together with our neighbors, people around us, and create that a community of understanding and mutual respect, so that we can create harmonious society for our children and grandchildren. God bless all of you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much, Imam Majid. This is our attempt at creating a harmonious society. This is our small part that we'd like to play. As we move on to our main section, we're very excited to have NPR's journalist, Tom Gjelten, here with us today to flesh out some of the ideas in Asma's book. Before I hand it over to Tom, who'll be moderating today, let me offer brief bios of both the author and the moderator. I'm sure all of you already know Tom Gjelten, but he reports on religion, faith, and belief for NPR News, a beat that encompasses such areas as the changing religious landscape in America, the formation of personal identity, the role of religion in politics and conflict, and arising from religious differences. His reporting draws on many years of covering national and international news from the posts in Washington and around the world. Tom has won many awards, including 2 Overseas Press Club Awards, a George Polk Award, and a Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award. He is also a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. His resume is quite expansive, and we did not do it justice today, but you can check it out online. We'll put the link in the chat box. Asma Uddin is the author of When Islam is Not a Religion: Inside America's Fight for Religious Freedom and the Politics of Vulnerability, How to Heal Muslim-Christian Relations in a Post-Christian America. She is an Inclusive American Project Fellow at the Aspen Institute, where she is leading a project on Muslim-Christian polarization in the US. Ms. Uddin was formerly legal counsel at the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty and has held academic fellowships at Georgetown and UCLA. She is also an expert advisor on religious freedom to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Ms. Uddin is a graduate of the University of Chicago Law School. Before I hand it over to Tom, I just want to let everyone know, if you have a question, you can drop it into the chat bar or on Facebook. We'll be checking those and we'll filter those, and Tom will be asking those questions. So Tom, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Shahid. Let me express my appreciation also to Imam Majid for those inspiring words of introduction, which I think set the stage very well for this conversation. So Asma Uddin and I have a bit of a history. We've done this act a number of times. I've said to Asma before, and maybe it's time we take this on the road because I think we've gotten pretty good at it. I can say so myself, Asma. I've always been fascinated by Asma's scholarship and writing. It's not only for its intellectual integrity, but for its courage and its independence. Asma writes in this book, at a time of growing polarization, standing in the middle can become more difficult, even frightening. That is a position that I really applaud and want to do everything I can to support, which is one of the reasons that I always am eager to be in a conversation with you, Asma. I want to begin by going back a decade to your work with the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty 10 years ago. At that time, your clients were primarily Christian institutions who saw their religious freedom restricted by the Obama administration's policies and regulations. Just today, I reviewed your testimony in the House Judiciary Committee back in 2012, where you were very critical of the Obama administration's policies as they restricted the freedom of Christian institutions, I'm emphasizing, because then in your 2019 book, as Shahid mentioned, When Islam is Not a Religion, you were more concerned with attacks on Muslims and those who claimed that Islam does not deserve First Amendment protection because it is not really a religion. And now with this book, your focus is on Muslim-Christian relations. What I'm curious about, Asma, is over these last 10 years, how would you say your religious freedom work has evolved? How has it changed? Is it different now? Are you emphasizing different things now than you were 10 years ago when you were at the Becket Fund?
Well, thank you. Thank you first to Shahid and to the American Muslim Institution for organizing this event today. And for everyone who came out and is watching on Facebook and who watches this recording after the fact. And thank you also, Tom. For the first book, When Islam is Not a Religion, it was a whirlwind of a tour. And I ended up being on stage with Tom a number of times in Texas and then a couple of times in DC. And so I'm excited to be doing it again with the new book. So your question, and it's a good one. I should say that the Becket Fund, it hasn't been 10 years since I was at the Becket Fund. It's only been a few years, but I was at the Becket Fund for a while, almost a decade. And what's interesting though, is when I first started out there, well, for the first couple of years, I was working on international religious freedom issues. So I wasn't even really looking at the domestic front. And of course, that gives you a completely different perspective, because when you take this conversation abroad, it really is a question of life and death and just very basic violations of human expression and autonomy. And then when you can turn the focus to the US, everything looks just so much more fine-tuned and nuanced. And you're grateful. I am grateful as an advocate that we can have conversations about institutions and about religious symbols and things that are beyond the scope of just life and death. And during my first few years litigating, even on the domestic front, the issues weren't Christian institutions. They were actually, my first domestic matter was involved in Oregon law that banned public school teachers from wearing religious garb. And we were actually advocating on behalf of Sikh Americans and Muslim women who were wearing hijab as public school teachers. And noting that even though these laws were rooted in anti-Catholic animus and were driven by a desire to stop nuns in wearing their habits from teaching in public schools, that today they actually impact an entirely different group of people. And so working on issues like that, working on matters such as access to kosher meals in prison, the ability of Sikh Americans to be able to carry their ceremonial dagger into federal schools, federal buildings, religious arbitration, including by Muslims, houses of worship struggles by a number of different groups. It came from a place where I was very non-politicized or relatively depoliticized, and then suddenly it became something else. The Beckett Fund actually represented the Green family and Hobby Lobby in its case at the Supreme Court. And as you noted, that was the one case out of many that challenged the Affordable Care Act's contraception mandate that required employers, both nonprofit and for-profit, from providing a range of contraception as part of their employee health insurance plan, despite the widely accepted and understood belief that, at least everyone knows, lots of people know that the Catholic Church opposes the use of contraception. And that case, you know, the Hobby Lobby case, which was brought by Protestants, not by Catholics, only objected to drugs that constituted abortifacients and not non-abortifacient contraception, ended up becoming an incredible flashpoint. And for me, I actually attribute it as the turning point, I think, at the sort of starting point in our current iteration of the culture wars. And to be at the center of that was pretty overwhelming, but I think, you know, I'm also very grateful for it because I think it's given me insight, given who I am, given that I am a member of not just a religious minority, but a particularly despised religious minority, to be able to stand and to be able to view these things from a very different perspective. You know, but on the question of, you know, how did I end up kind of going from that, you know, then to Hobby Lobby and then to a book that says When Islam is Not a Religion, it's really because I was in the space where religious freedom was being talked about as what it is, a fundamental human right that is important to human autonomy, human self-expression, to our quest for meaning and truth. But then, quite strangely, was being advocated by many of the same people who understood religious freedom as important for themselves to somehow be completely denied to an entire group of people, i.e. Muslim Americans. And I just didn't, you know, I was troubled by that hypocrisy. And of course, that came really into sharp view during the the 2016 presidential campaign, and of course the Trump era, where you saw lots of talk about the importance of religious freedom, but lots of talk also about how Muslims shouldn't have access to it.
So Asma, would you say that this has been kind of a disappointing period where your support for religious freedom for example, conservative Christians has not always been reciprocated by their support for religious freedom for Muslims? Has this been a kind of a disappointing revelation for you personally?
It has been disappointing. It's been troubling in many different ways. I mean, I remember telling you a story, Tom, for one of your pieces where I shared how I was at this religious freedom rally, and, you know, and I very intentionally put myself there. I don't think it was a shocker to me. I kind of knew that there was like this undercurrent of Islamophobia or like strong anti-Muslim fear. And, you know, I very intentionally was like, how do I put myself in this place where I can reach people in a way that others just aren't able to reach? And that's really the piece of it that became clear to me, not just when I'm at this rally, which, by the way, the story is that I went up to the mic in front of an entire group of conservative white Christians who were there, again, rallying for religious freedom. It was called the Stand Up for Religious Freedom Rally, waving their signs, like, you know, there was lots of chants but also music and dancing. I mean, it was a rally. And then suddenly I went up there and I was like, I'm an American Muslim and I'm here coming in support of your religious freedom rights, but I fully expect that in return, you protect the rights of my religious community. And suddenly there was just total silence. It was like complete silence. And it was almost like they just didn't know what to make of that. And then I saw this in an extended way when I was on tour with my book, When Islam is Not a Religion, which was actually hosted by a number of different very conservative groups, including evangelical universities and religious groups and so on. And I was fascinated, one, by the fact that I was invited there, but secondly, by the fact that I was received quite well, and the fact that these people were very much open and excited about engaging with me in a conversation about religious freedom. And it really made me kind of think, what is it that I'm doing? What is it that I have done in my career and in my book, and now in this book talk, at you know, any given book talk, in front of a conservative audience, that's somehow getting across these tribal lines, these tribal barriers. And so that's what I probe in this new book.
Right. And remind me what year that was, Asma, roughly?
So
that was before Trump came in, wasn't it?
The rallies?
Yeah,
Yeah, so that was during when during the Obama years when all the lawsuits were happening.
right. Do you think that support for Muslim Americans has actually then declined in the last, let's say, 5 years?
Support for American Muslims. Well, I mean, I think all the polling data, for example, during the Trump era, in terms of people's support for the travel ban, still saw, of course, higher support among Republicans, but more specifically, the highest support among white evangelicals.
Right.
And then, of course, in terms of general stereotypes about Muslims, there's still pretty high levels of that.
So going back to this question of how your work has evolved over the last 10 years, how would you say, are you still speaking to the same audience that you were speaking to 10 years ago? Or are you looking with this new book, are you sort of focused on a different audience than you might have been addressing 10 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, Tom, the one thing that makes my work really complicated, whether it's talking about cases or it's writing books, it's that I don't have a very narrow audience, right? Like, it's just like, well, who am I reaching out to? The political right, the political left, the people in the middle. And that's really what makes it hard sometimes. Like, how do you write in a way that doesn't alienate one particular group of people, while in parts of the book I'm trying to talk to the left, and then other parts I'm trying to talk to the right. But I'm really just trying to talk to Americans who are interested in moving past our polarized politics. And so in that, but so I think that's always been the stance I've taken, but I think what's changed is that I've kind of moved beyond just purely the religious, to looking also at the questions of politics, polarization, political science, social psychology. And so those are the elements, this is the space that I've kind of transitioned into, where I'm sort of bridging the legal and then all these other fields.
So there are a lot of issues I want to cover here in this conversation. I recognize our time is limited, and I do want to make sure that people listening in or watching have a chance to ask questions as well. One thing that I'm curious about, Asma, and you are the perfect person to answer this, is how much of a difference is there on the issue of sort of religious freedom, tolerance, prejudice, when a religion is in the majority as opposed to being in the minority? You've done a lot of work in Pakistan, where you were very concerned with blasphemy laws. Of course, there Islam is the majority religion, and Christians are the sort of the beleaguered minority. In the United States, it's just the reverse. Do you find sort of the same dynamic happening across societies, depending on which is the majority and which is the minority? Are the majority religion, the majority community always sort of like hegemonic or dominant, and the minority community is always oppressed, regardless of what faith tradition they represent?
So no, I think the important thing with respect to, for example, Muslim majority states, a lot of them are sort of talked about as one and the same, that all Muslim majority states have a particular position on religious freedom, often sort of seen as religiously oppressive. But in fact, there's been important work done on that distinguishes among the different states, and has found that almost a quarter of Muslim majority states, for example, are classified as religiously free, and thus providing pretty wide protections for religious minorities and majorities alike. But there's a different piece of this, and it's actually a dynamic that I explore in the book when I talk about this question of vulnerability, right? So it's called politics of vulnerability. And what is the vulnerability based on? Where is it coming from? And so we see lots of popular commentary on the evangelical persecution complex, it's called, or the siege mentality, is which you'll see a lot of Christian leaders using that phrase. And I was interested in probing what that is. And coming from a place where I was like, there are changes happening in the United States that are massive, and they've been happening very quickly. A lot of people kind of looking at the Trump election, the rise of populism, even in Europe, or just like, it's not just that things are changing, but they're changing at a very fast pace, at a pace in which the group that was previously a dominant majority, both in terms of demographics and also in terms of cultural influence, just is having a hard time adapting to, because it's happening so quickly in such large numbers. And it was interesting to me that analysis was happening fairly objectively when it came to Europe, but less so when it came to the United States, even though a lot of the same dynamics are at play here in the United States as well. There's a book by Robert Jones called The End of White Christian America that talks about just how quickly, I mean, the fact that white Protestants used to, for a long time, be the majority in this country, and now they're actually a minority. Even, white preponderance is on the decline. So in 1965, white Americans constituted 84% of the US population. And now Pew says that whites will be a minority by 2055. And so again, that's not just in terms of numbers, but there's also the fact that the cultural institutions are also changing really quickly. And as I explained in the book, I think a sort of big marker of how quickly and drastically the culture has changed was the case in 2015 decided by the Supreme Court of Obergefell v. Hodges that declared a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. And for a lot of traditional conservative white Christians, that was a sign that things were so different from the America that they once knew. And then they often, to be honest, had a lot of influence on it. So that was a signal that, okay, maybe our influence is not as strong as it used to be. So I look at these dynamics, but I look at it as an attempt to explain to the reader, here are these people who are, yes, they're white conservative Christians, but they're also just human. And they're going through these processes that any other human, especially a part of a majority group anywhere else in the world, experiencing it would be reacting in many of the same ways. And here I think I need to make a distinction between violent actors versus non-violent actors, people who are very exclusionary, such as Christian nationalists, which I distinguish in the book from conservative white evangelicals, for example. So I'm not really speaking in defense of like all those different types of people. I'm specifically speaking in terms of conservative white evangelicals who are non-nationalists and non-violent, and explaining what those dynamics are. And in support of that, I also use empirical studies related to group identity and intergroup bias, and explain that while group identity by itself is not problematic, what ends up happening, what often resulting in hostility, is when the in-group or the majority group suddenly faces very different dynamics, where it's gone from being powerful to suddenly being challenged in that dominance, and then it reacts with hostility. So again, a very human phenomenon, and one that I think we're seeing in the United States.
Yeah, I want to get into sort of some of the solutions or strategies that you think make sense. I was intrigued by one little story that you tell in your book of how when liberals who might have been suspicious or unsupportive of religious freedom claims by, let's say, the baker who doesn't want to make a cake for a gay couple, how when those liberals are presented with kind of an analogous situation of Muslim truck drivers who don't want to deliver beer or alcohol because it violates their religious beliefs, that those liberals then become more sensitive or more understanding of the claims that are made by the baker. Are there other examples that you can think of that sort of suggest a way to kind of break down some of these preconceptions that people have?
Yeah, when I saw that study, I was fascinated. One, because I think it says a lot about how we're not really entrenched in certain beliefs, but it's really just about how things are communicated to us, and how we think that they align with our sort of loyalty to our particular political tribes. But also because it reaffirms something that I had found during my own experiences. And so while I was on this book tour with When Islam is Not a Religion, I wasn't just addressing conservative audiences. I was also addressing groups that I would call liberal or sort of centrist. And I had this presentation that I love doing, and I've done in lots of different contexts, where I kind of take the audience through a series of different cases. Everything from the challenge to the Oklahoma anti-Sharia law, to Masterpiece Cake Shop that involved a Christian baker, as you noted, Tom, who declined to make a custom cake for a gay couple, to a case challenging a statue of Jesus on federally owned land, to just a whole range of other things, and then to international as well, because I think sometimes you have to go outside the US to help people look a little bit more objectively at what's going on in the United States. And I'll sort of talk about these principles and I'll weave them through these drastically different fact scenarios. And in the end, I would say liberal audiences or people I would classify as center left, you know, they would just say things like, okay, we just went on this, you just took us on an emotional roller coaster. Like, you know, like they were just so confused. Like we went from being like really upset to being really, you know, angry to being sad. And they just were sort of left kind of confused, I guess, in terms of like, they had these feelings that they associated with certain cases. And then I just sort of jumbled it up for them. And I think for me, like that's a win. If I can just confuse people and begin to sort of like make those tribal lines a little bit less definite, then I think that's a win.
And that's precisely what impresses me. I mean, that's to me personally as well, as a religion correspondent, that's always sort of been my standard as well. So I'm really thrilled to hear you say that. You have some examples of so you were just talking about sort of confusing liberals. How about, have you got some success stories where you've been able to sort of confuse conservative Christians, make them more sensitive? I mean, you tell the story of Pastor Roberts and all the work that he has done. Are there some specific examples where you've seen conservative Christians sort of rethink their intolerance or their prejudice?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the type of scenario that led me to write this book. Again, being in places where I think sometimes they were even ready to kind of, I mean, first being invited into these conservative spaces is a win in and of itself. And, you know, being like, I opened the politics of vulnerability with my, you know, sitting on stage at the National Religious Broadcasters annual convention, doing one of their plenary talks. And for those who don't know, NRB is a group of conservative Christian broadcasters from around the world who actually have to sign a statement of faith to be part of that group. And to be invited there by the chairwoman of the board and a major name conservative Christian talk radio, Janet Parshall, was pretty big. I mean, just the fact that I was there. And so so the response to what I was saying and the fact that I was there, not only advocating religious liberty for all, but of course, specifically calling out conservatives for what they have done to challenge those rights. And the fact that I was still welcomed, given a platform and talked to honestly, it led me to think, you know, what is going on here? Like we're so used to as a country kind of being in our political bunkers where we sort of think that whoever's criticizing us must inherently be wrong and possibly even evil. And we should just avoid them at all costs. And now I'm being invited into spaces to essentially criticize them. And so, you know, I was like, if I can figure out what's going on here and find a way to explain it, then maybe this is, as Shah had mentioned in his introduction, a way that we can begin to rethink all of these other political divides, even beyond the Muslim Christian context.
And I think you wrote in that book that you felt that for some of your hosts who witnessed that and had to sort of come to your defense in public, that was a learning moment for them. They took something from that.
Yeah, I mean, again, the NRB example was that before actually the plenary talk started, there was something very different that happened. And so my talk was preceded by a talk by a former Attorney General, Bill Barr, and the person who sponsored his talk and introduced Bill Barr was Frank Gaffney, who, of course, watching this from the green room, when I saw Frank Gaffney go up, and Frank Gaffney is well known as being virulently like anti-Muslim, sort of a leader of Fear Incorporated, as it's been dubbed by the Center for American Progress. And here he was going up there, and he took the opportunity to tell the crowd that I'm here because I have sponsored Bill Barr's talk. He runs a group called Save the Persecuted Christians, which going back to this idea of persecution and vulnerability. But I want to make clear to everyone that I have not sponsored the panel that comes right after, which includes this woman, he didn't say my name, but it was obviously me, who he labeled a Sharia supremacist. And you can imagine my reaction to this, you know, as I'm watching this in the green room, and I'm just like, you know, and he said, you know, I'm disappointed that this organization has chosen to give her a platform, but I hope that you yourself do not give her a platform. Of course, and I had no idea what that would mean and what exactly he was trying to incite the crowd to do. And then Janet Parshall, who is like very, very conservative, the fact that she started, not only did she come to me in the green room to apologize for that, but then made it a point to start our panel with a public apology. And then I was approached by a number of audience members after the fact who apologized themselves and thanked me for my work and my remarks. And I think for me, that was, I mean, I think this is more a realization on my part, Tom, where I was just like, I kind of knew there was a distinction there because I was used to working with conservatives, but to see it in such stark form, I thought was really important. And of course, after the fact, I published an opinion editorial in Religion News Service, and the incident was also reported on in brief by the Associated Press, so it was kind of syndicated everywhere. And there were a number of people, very conservative advocates on Twitter, who also spoke up in my defense and kind of came out in support of my work. So I think that was an important or clarifying moment for lots of people.
Well, on the other hand, you blew my mind with a discussion in your book about the term interfaith and how you have actually tried to avoid using that term. I mean, I couldn't believe it that for some people, interfaith is a bad word. And you have been encouraged to avoid it because it, quote, sounds liberal. Which leads me to my next question. I mean, you know, one of the things about, and I'm curious whether this is an obstacle to bridging Christian-Muslim relations, conservative Christianity makes a claim to universal truth, and to an extent, Islam does as well. In both these faith traditions, there is a kind of a notion of certainty that is associated with these faiths. How do you get around that when working to promote, you know, religious reconciliation, if you have devoutly religious people who believe that their truth is the one and only true truth?
So I don't think that there's any conflict between those two things. In fact, I think what makes religious freedom such a potent tool, and I talk about it in the book as a subordinate goal, like this bigger goal that can help people who are otherwise seemingly hopelessly divided perhaps come together, is because the nature of religious freedom is that it really protects your ability to be true to whatever beliefs you hold. You don't have to compromise any of that. You don't have to water it down. I think that people have assumptions around things like tolerance and perhaps even the word pluralism, where there's sort of this, or even civic discourse. There's so many different things that you think are, morally good or morally neutral that have now come to be seen as signs of weakness or selling out. And I think that's unfortunate. But I also think that religious freedom does a really good job if we can sort of rescue it from its politicized politicization of it, where it helps. It says nothing in this for the left or the right, or for people who hold positions on both sides. You don't have to give up what you believe is right. You can absolutely believe in the full rights for LGBTQ individuals, even as against religious objections. You can also believe absolutely the opposite. But there is a way. This, if anything, this is a tool for negotiation, and for people to figure out if there's a way we can create a society in which people of diverse beliefs can live together, even as they hold on to very different beliefs. And I think that's a really important point. Again, working with evangelicals and working with conservative Christians and seeing kind of like their knee-jerk reactions to things like interfaith. They also have a really bad reaction to the word Islamophobia. They have to kind of work around. It's like you see what their fears are. They have this idea that all of this is somehow about watering down their convictions, watering down their theology, compromising their theology. And to which I say no. I mean, in fact, I have very absolute beliefs as well, religious beliefs, as you said. And I don't think there's anything about my work that requires me to give that up. And I think that's the important point to make.
Have you ever encountered any evangelical Christians who regard it as their religious duty to convert Muslims to Christianity? And I guess by the same token, Muslims who feel the need to proselytize in a similar way?
Yeah, so I mean, I have faced, it's a bit of a industry, like a cottage industry among, I would say, conservative Christians generally, because the people I dealt with were conservative Catholic, not evangelical. But you'll see these books. Like I think a number of American Muslims I've seen them posted on Facebook. Well, they'll just receive a book in the mail that has like a picture of an apparently allegedly former Muslim who has found Jesus. It's almost like we're like this bounty for proselytizers or missionaries to try to convert a Muslim specifically, more so than any other non-Christian. And I have faced that. And I think this is interesting because I think, there was a time when I was at Beckett doing the work that I was doing where people outside Beckett somehow interpreted that if I'm working for religious freedom and specifically advocating for Christians, among others, that somehow signaled a weakness in my faith and that a kind of an opening for conversion. And so I have very distinct memories, for example, of being, a Catholic couple taking me out to dinner, and the conversation made it apparent to me that there were certain intentions there, and then like subsequent emails and so on. And so, it's just, for me, I see it as an opportunity to sort of share how deeply felt my faith is, and that it's not something that is nominal, and that in fact the work that I do for religious freedom is something that's very much motivated by my faith and my own religious experiences.
I'd like to share a story myself, Asma, that I think underscores the importance of the strength of one's faith can be an argument for religious freedom. I interviewed a Muslim woman who grew up in the South, immersed in an evangelical Christian culture. And she told me that she found her Christian friends there to be more supportive of her need to pray than her liberal secular friends. This is what she told me. She said, "I'm so grateful to have been a Muslim growing up in the South. Only in the South can you say to your friend, hey, you know what? I've got to pray." And they'd be like, of course. Like, they talked about God in a very personal way. Their relationship with Jesus made me want to have a closer relationship with God. So she found that her very piety, her very faith devotion was, instead of being an obstacle to understanding evangelical Christians, was actually a link, because they both had very strong faith feelings that they could then share and sort of bond around.
Yeah, I can totally relate. So after law school, I actually worked as a corporate litigator for a couple of years. Again, just a very bad fit there. But but I saw the difference, in the sense that I had to hide my faith. And we have 5 obligatory prayers, several of which come into play when you're in the office pretty late. And it was just kind of like a scurry, kind of like, how do I get these prayers in, for example? How do I do sort of the ritual washing? How do I do all this without being found out? And then I left and I went to the Beckett Fund, where we had diverse religious followers, Jewish and diversity of different types of Christians, members of the LDS Church, Catholics who left for Mass every day at noon. And suddenly it was like, hey, can I get a lock on my door? I have to pray 5 times a day, and I gotta go, I gotta go pray. That's what I was doing. And I'm fasting, don't have to really explain anything, so on and so forth. And I noticed that change, the fact that I could just talk about it. It's like, religion is a natural part of many people's lives. And unfortunately, in lots of environments, we have to hide it, either because it's not acceptable, it's not considered professional, or maybe it's even looked down upon and associated with some sort of irrationality, perhaps. So I definitely can relate to that. And what's interesting is when I posted about this book on Facebook, talking about my desire to sort of rethink and help society rethink its approach to conservative Christians, people started sharing some of those same anecdotes in the Facebook comments. Whereas, when I was in college, I remember my best conversations around religion were with my Christian friends. And that's, I think, really important to just also understand how shared experiences of spirituality and shared connections to the divine, even if we have very different conceptions of what the divine is an important shared experience that I think sometimes people of all religious faiths can connect around.
So we have a couple of questions here that are somewhat similar. So I'm going to group them together. One is, what terms should the average layperson use, and what role should lay people play in order to build bridges? And speaking of terminology, our viewer says, if the word interfaith has a negative ring to it, what's the correct word for those of us who are working in this space? Language, I guess, terminology is important, isn't it, Asma?
Yeah, it's absolutely important. I mean, the question of interfaith, I think there's a lot there. I mean, what I've heard is that multi-faith works better. But I think that you can find just other, just themes that you're talking about, as opposed to necessarily dubbing something an interfaith conversation. What the interfaith, just to give some background around sort of what that is. On the one hand, there's this feeling among evangelicals that it is a compromising of their faith. But there is a chapter in my book where I explain the role of conspiracy theorists and demagogues in creating fear around certain terminology and certain ideas. And so in the book, I talk about this concept of mega identities. And if you look at the cover of the book, you'll see that the star and crescent is in blue and the cross is in red. And what I talk about in the book is this concept one of mega identities, where our political identities as either conservatives or liberals, one, the fact that they've been sort of completely separated that way, as opposed to letting people be in the middle, have now extended beyond simply our positions on social issues or on policy matters, to include a whole range of things. So Shahid mentioned at the start, whether you shop at Whole Foods, that kind of gives away your politics. And there have actually been studies, there's associations like this, but there have actually been studies that people who eat sushis and eat and drink lattes actually do tend to be liberals. And so there's now people who eat sushi, drink lattes, drive either a hybrid or electric car, shop at Whole Foods and Trader Joe's are associated with the Team Blue, Democrats. And then people who drive like Land Rovers and eat at Cracker Barrel are associated with Team Red. And so similarly, Muslims now, as I explain in the book, have become a trait of the liberal mega identity. So we have become, or the defense of Muslims' rights has become something indelibly connected to liberals, so that, regardless of whether or not 50% of the American Muslim population tends to be really conservative on social issues, in the minds of Team Red, we are now all grouped into one side, and that in itself is a huge reason to oppose us and our rights. And so what's happened is there's a line by Ezra Klein that I quote in the book where he says that to the extent that these feelings of vulnerability, the people's feelings of vulnerability, regardless of what we think about them, but the extent that they feel it is as true, if you ignore them, what ends up happening is that you create this opening for demagogues and reactionaries to come in and manipulate and to weaponize it. And I saw that line in his book and I was like, oh my God, that's exactly what's going on with Muslims. I mean, I'm already thinking about these questions of vulnerability, about this tribal politics. And then I see Frank Gaffney and all the other people in his group at Fear Inc. who have spun these theories about an Islamist leftist conspiracy to take over the United States. And if it sounds crazy to you, you should actually start to look at some of the comments and op-eds, because once I learned about this, you see evidence everywhere. And there's lots of books being written about it, people with very, very wide followings, such as Ben Shapiro, who is not Christian, but who has a major following among conservatives, who has very explicitly said that the reason that people on the left protect Muslims' rights is because they're trying to partner with all groups with whom they can destroy the current system and remake it in their own image. And so there's lots of books out there on leftist Islamist conspiracy, the red-green axis, they call it, red for Marxism, green for Islam. And so in this conspiracy, this world of conspiracy theories, which again is not without mainstream influence, interfaith then is seen as a tool that the left propagates in order to help Muslims take over and sort of dupe unsuspecting evangelicals and other Christians into this apparently, this nefarious agenda. So I think you have to.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I wanted to elaborate on this, on the notion of the importance of vulnerability. I mean, you're talking about how it has been weaponized by demagogues. You say that the politics of vulnerability has to be overcome. On the other hand, remember Imam Majid at the beginning said that we need to be more open to being vulnerable ourselves. So that raises the question of whether, vulnerability, how does one allow oneself to become more vulnerable, and how is that a positive thing as opposed to sort of leaving yourself open to being manipulated? Can you explain a little bit that dynamic around vulnerability?
Sure, and you have to lean into that vulnerability. To take a phrase from Brene Brown, who's become quite the pop figure when it comes to questions of vulnerability. And this goes to the question from Ambassador Siddiqui, or sorry, Shahid, about the average layperson. What can the average layperson do? And I think these dynamics between us and others as humans, I think, are really key to this. And there's lots more. I do offer lots of sort of concrete strategies in the book itself. But a big part of it is just really kind of understanding the person you're engaging with, regardless of what their positions are and how passionately you disagree with them, as fundamentally human, which we talked about earlier with regard to shared, human experiences among people across the world when they're the majority or minority. And similarly with vulnerability, Brene Brown in her book says we have to learn how to lean into our vulnerability and how to feel hurt instead of spreading hurt. And I think sometimes when we're denied that opportunity to feel hurt and denied credibility to our experiences, that's how our feelings end up becoming weaponized and politicized in the way that they have become. And so in the book, with respect to Christians, because I am using this Muslim Christian example as my case study in vulnerability, I explain not just where the vulnerability is coming from, but also the way that media portrayals and politicians and others have constantly sort of mocked this group of people for feeling what they feel, which then leads to this process of the weaponization of this vulnerability, the politicization, which again, often positions Muslims as collateral damage, where it's not us who's berating them, although some individual Muslims might do that, but we end up feeling the heat.
And Shahid would like you just to expound a bit more on the role that the media has played in perpetuating that vulnerability mentality.
Yeah, I mean, so in our current polarized context, media, whether it be news, unfortunately, not just op-eds, not just opinion editorials, but also sometimes the way that stories are reported on in the news. And I know this firsthand in the context of religious freedom, being interviewed for many such pieces and really trying to shift the narrative in a particular piece about, beyond just the usual culture war lens, and then kind of seeing the way the piece comes out in the typical culture war lens. It's always sort of like they've adopted this idea that there is this inherent dichotomy in which powerful white Christians are pitted against a range of marginalized minorities. And that is a frame that is imposed over and over again on a lot of these stories that tend to be a lot more complicated. When I was at the Beckett Fund, when I was working on cases such as Hobby Lobby, I realized how when you actually look at the law, when you look at the facts of the case, if you actually explain that to people, even people very much on the left, they get it. And they actually end up supporting, in many cases, what the court decided. But that's not how those things are reported on in the media. And they're reported on in terms of these easy sound bites about Christians, for example, being bigoted or waging a war on women. And people are so quick to adopt those frames that it just really becomes hard to explain something otherwise to them.
So these conversations that we're discussing sort of in the abstract are obviously good and important. In real life, they can be really difficult. And I just want to highlight one example. You write in the book that faith-based adoption agencies can be especially effective in placing special needs kids. And I think one of the points you're making is that we need to we need to sort of have more respect for faith-based approaches to some of these social services. But then comes the question of whether a Christian social service agency should be able to refuse to place children for adoption in a non-Christian home. I mean, that's a kind of a difficult question. How do you, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, how do you have these conversations around issues that sort of raise, on the one hand, legitimate religious freedom issues, but on the other hand, also equally legitimate human rights issues or civil rights issues?
I mean, there's always a prevailing standard in place, right? So religious freedom is not something that means, okay, you're free to do whatever you want, right? There's always countervailing concerns and legitimate bases upon which the government can interfere and restrict your rights if they pass the legal threshold. And so, for example, in the context of an adoption agency, similar to the question of the Christian baker and many other things, or for example, a pharmacist who doesn't want to dispense contraception because he or she is Catholic. and thinks that that's going to, facilitate something that they believe is wrong. In all of those cases, like access tends to be a huge sort of issue, sort of central part of this analysis of whether or not the government has a compelling interest in restricting you and forcing you to do something that violates your belief. So if you have an agency that somehow, has a monopoly on, foster care and adoption in a particular locality, that's a very, very different situation from when foster care parents or potential adoptive parents can go elsewhere to find children that can be placed with them. So that's one, kind of like looking at the bigger picture. What exactly are the dynamics here, and what is the level of hardship that is being placed? The second part of it is, I just sort of think, well, let's change the religion out of this, right? So instead of Christian, let's make it Muslim, right? So as far as I know, there's only one Muslim adoption agency in the United States, and they mostly deal with these refugee children from Syria. And they only place, and it's these Syrian Muslim refugee children, and they only place these children with Muslim families. And I'm like, let's think about this. I mean, they're raised in this particular context, and if you put them in a drastically different religious family, like what are going to be the repercussions, not to mention their ability to continue living out their faith. And so I think sometimes it's like, instead of thinking about the Christian who's turning away the Muslim, just think about the Muslim perhaps who might be turning away the Christian, and see how you feel about that.
Yeah. Well, those are really important. I'm going to turn it over to Shahid back to Shahid in a moment, but there was one other question from Muazzam Saeed, who is curious about sort of the role. This is really a mega question, Asma, the role of religion in conflicts. Do you see, he asked whether religious conflicts today come out of sort of conservative, unsubstantiated supremacist claims, or do they arise from religious teachings from the theology themselves? Can theology itself be a source of religious conflict?
From my perspective, both internationally and domestically, I think that identity politics has like a huge part. Now, I'm not going to say that theology is completely separated. I think that theology can play a supporting role. I think that you can justify what you're otherwise politically motivated to do and sort of make it resonate with a larger crowd, like a larger audience, and sort of attach it to some sort of higher principle that you're purportedly fighting in support of by referring to theology and to certain religious ideas. But my experience has been that a lot of this is political. I have, as you had noted, worked on international issues. I've worked on, for example, blasphemy law issues in Pakistan. And I know that, for example, the current text of the blasphemy laws cite a source for their position on the death penalty that actually, when you go to the original Arabic source, says the exact opposite of what it's being cited for. And I know someone who actually raised this issue with the person who wrote the law, who then said he's not going to edit it, he's not going to change it because it is not, quote unquote, in the public good. And what does that really mean? And you start digging into the politics of some of this stuff, you start seeing that a lot of this is really a war between Islam versus secularism, Islam versus specifically the secular West, and the way that these laws sort of like help to perpetuate some of these identity struggles. Similarly, in the United States, that's exactly what the book is about. The way that our political tribal warfare has taken on religion, and even used religious freedom and converted it into a partisan tool, where more than anything else, it's become a way of our defending our particular stake in this country. And now it's sort of become like this team blue versus team red thing, so that even if it means denying the rights of an entire other religious group, we're going to do it because that's what's going to help us and our team win.
Well, it's a really important book, Asma. It's a terrific and very important book, as I say, The Politics of Vulnerability. Imam Majid said at the beginning that he wanted to see this book become a manual for religious leaders. I would broaden that. It should be a manual for everyone who wants to work for a more inclusive society and for greater tolerance. So it's got broad applicability. It's really user-friendly, reader-friendly, beautifully written, easy to follow. And thank you very much for writing it, Asma. And thanks for this opportunity to have a conversation with you. As I said, I respect all that you do, and I'm going to turn it back now to Shahid Rahman for some closing comments.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you so much, Asma. I really appreciate you guys being here today. I hope, Asma, you take Tom's offer and take this show on the road. I think people would really benefit from a great deal of wisdom and experience, and not only from your coverage in the media, but also the experience you have on the ground. I think you're in a very unique position. And, I think more broadly, you gave the example of Pakistan, and it seems like a war on secularism. I think I had one line that I read in the book that was so interesting for me was, Bill Barr's commentary on the role the media is playing in secularizing the country. And I'm wondering if there's a broader element, and not necessarily about religion, but about reacting to what people are perceiving as, encroaching secularism, whatever that means. And I look forward to reading about that in your third book. If you haven't purchased her book yet, The Politics of Vulnerability, I really recommend everyone to do so. I have put a link on the chat, and I'll do so again. And again, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. This program will be on our Facebook Live and also will be on YouTube, and feel free to share it with your friends. Again, thank you, Tom and Asma, for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you guys again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.